"Oh my goodness, Hank! What on earth have you brought home?" Maggie Sullivan's voice rang through the quiet countryside as she rushed out onto the porch, her golden retriever wagging his tail proudly. Hank, with his fluffy golden coat shimmering under the late afternoon sun, stood at the base of the porch steps, his mouth full of something long, dark, and strange. It wasn't a stick or one of the many chewed-up toys he tended to find in the woods behind their home. No, this was something entirely different. Maggie's heart pounded as she stepped closer. She had lived in Brooksville, Indiana, her whole life, and nothing about the peaceful town ever suggested she'd stumble upon anything unusual. But the way Hank was beaming at her, as if he'd just uncovered the world's greatest treasure, made her both nervous and curious. "Drop it, buddy," she said, her voice a mix of gentle encouragement and apprehension. Hank obeyed instantly, his tongue lolling out in excitement as he sat down, clearly expecting praise. Maggie swallowed hard as she knelt and got a better look. It was wrapped in dirt, bits of dried leaves sticking to it, and it smelled odd. Not rotten, not foul, but something she couldn't quite place. A faint shimmer caught her eye in the dying sunlight. She hesitated before reaching out and wiping away some of the dirt with her sleeve. Her breath hitched. It was smooth, metallic, not rusted, not worn, but as if it had been buried only a short time ago. The more she rubbed, the clearer the shape became. It wasn't just some piece of metal. It was an intricately designed object, about the length of her forearm, with tiny engravings running along its length. The design reminded her of something ancient, something important, though she had no idea what it could be. "Where did you find this, boy?" she asked, rubbing Hank's head as she stared at the object. Hank panted happily, his tail sweeping the ground as he turned toward the woods. Maggie followed his gaze. The woods stretched for miles behind her home, mostly undisturbed except for the occasional hiker or lost traveler. Had Hank really dug this up from the ground? And if so, how deep had it been buried? A shiver ran down her spine, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of curiosity pressing in on her. She needed answers. Standing up, she dusted off her jeans and turned toward the house. Her mind raced as she considered who she should call. The sheriff? No, this wasn't a crime scene. The town historian? Maybe, but she doubted Mr. Jenkins would know much about buried artifacts. That left only one logical option. Dr. Martin, the town's veterinarian. It wasn't that she thought he'd have all the answers, but Hank was due for a checkup anyway, and if anyone could help her determine if this object was safe or even related to something living, it was Dr. Martin. "Come on, Hank," she said, scooping up the mysterious object and tucking it under her arm. "Let's go see Doc Martin." Hank barked excitedly, as if he knew this adventure was far from over. 20 minutes later, Maggie pulled up in front of the little brick building that housed Dr. Martin's veterinary clinic. The bell above the door chimed as she stepped inside, Hank trotting beside her. "Maggie! Hey there, Hank!" Dr. Martin greeted them warmly. He was a tall man in his mid-50s with a kind face and glasses that always seemed on the verge of sliding off his nose. "What brings you two in today?" Maggie didn't hesitate. She placed the object on the front counter and took a step back. "Hank found this buried in the woods behind my house. I have no idea what it is, but something about it feels important." Dr. Martin leaned in, his expression shifting from casual curiosity to something much more serious. He carefully picked up the object, turning it over in his hands. The room fell silent as he examined it. Then, suddenly, he gasped. Maggie stiffened. "What? What is it?" Dr. Martin looked at her, his eyes wide. "Maggie, where exactly did Hank find this?" "Behind my house," she said slowly. "Why?" He exhaled, rubbing his forehead as he studied the object again. Because, if I'm not mistaken, this shouldn't be here. Not in Indiana. Not anywhere near here. Maggie frowned. Doc, you're scaring me. Dr. Martin looked up, his face unreadable. You need to call someone, Maggie. This might be a lot bigger than we think. A heavy silence followed his words. Even Hank, usually bouncing with energy, seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. Maggie took a deep breath, steadying herself. Who do I call? Dr. Martin hesitated, then pulled out his phone. I might have a number for someone who can help, but Maggie, whatever this is, it might change everything. Maggie swallowed hard as she looked down at the object. She had no idea what she and Hank had just stumbled upon, but one thing was clear. Their quiet life in Brooksville was about to get a whole lot more interesting. Maggie watched as Dr. Martin tapped the screen of his phone, his fingers slightly trembling. Hank sat obediently by her feet, his tail occasionally thumping against the linoleum floor of the clinic. The room, normally filled with the comforting scent of antiseptic and pet treats, now carried an air of uncertainty that made Maggie's stomach twist. She had never seen Dr. Martin this unsettled before. He had been the town's veterinarian for over 20 years, a calm and steady presence for every worried pet owner in Brooksville. But as he scrolled through his contacts, his brows furrowed in concern, Maggie felt a creeping sense that whatever they had stumbled upon was beyond anything she could have imagined. Found it, Dr. Martin murmured, pressing the phone to his ear. He turned away slightly as he spoke. Hey, Roger. It's Mike Martin. Yeah, it's been a while. Listen, I have something here I need your expertise on. No, not an animal. It's an object, and I need someone who can take a look at it. Yeah, I can bring it to you. Tomorrow morning? Perfect. I'll be there. Maggie shifted on her feet, waiting for him to finish. When he finally hung up, he let out a slow breath and turned back to her. That was Roger Dunham. He's a retired archaeologist who used to work at the university in Indianapolis. He's got some connections to people who specialize in rare finds. If anyone can tell us what this is, it's him. Maggie folded her arms, staring at the object on the counter. So, we're taking it to him tomorrow? Dr. Martin nodded. First thing in the morning. I don't want to leave it sitting here overnight. If you don't mind, Maggie, I'd feel a lot better if you kept it at your place and brought it with you when we leave. Maggie hesitated, glancing at Hank. He was chewing idly on his leash, completely unfazed by the serious discussion happening around him. All right, she said finally, I'll keep it with me. Dr. Martin smiled reassuringly, though the concern never fully left his face. Good. We'll head out at sunrise. By the time Maggie and Hank got back home, the sky had darkened, and the cool night air carried the sounds of chirping crickets and rustling leaves. She set the mysterious object on her kitchen counter and stared at it, her thoughts racing. Hank patted over and nuzzled her leg. You don't even know what you found, do you? She muttered, scratching his head. He wagged his tail and gave her a big, slobbery lick on the hand. Maggie sighed and turned off the kitchen light, leaving the object untouched as she headed to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. She tossed and turned, her mind replaying Dr. Martin's reaction over and over again. What was it about the object that had made him so uneasy, and why did she feel like somehow finding it had set something in motion? Hank, as usual, slept soundly on the floor beside her bed, blissfully unaware of his owner's restless thoughts. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and Maggie drifted off into a fitful sleep. The next morning, she woke up to the sound of Hank whining at the door, eager for his morning walk. Groggily, she got dressed, grabbed the leash, and stepped outside into the crisp dawn air. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the trees. The world felt quiet, still, as if it were waiting for something to happen. She and Hank walked their usual route along the edge of the woods, the grass damp beneath her boots. She kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting to see something unusual, though she wasn't sure what she was looking for. The object had been buried out there somewhere, hidden for who knew how long, and now, because of Hank, it was sitting in her kitchen, about to be transported to someone who might actually know its significance. By the time she returned to her home, Dr. Martin's truck was already pulling into her driveway. She waved as he stepped out, carrying a thermos of coffee and looking more awake than she felt. "Morning," he called. "Ready to go?" "Yeah, just let me grab it." Maggie unclipped Hank's leash and hurried inside, retrieving the object from the counter. She wrapped it in an old towel before tucking it carefully into her bag. Then, with one last look at Hank, who was now sprawled out on the rug, exhausted from his walk, she locked the door and headed out. The drive to Indianapolis took a little over an hour, the early morning traffic light and the conversation between them sparse. Dr. Martin, though visibly calmer than the night before, still seemed preoccupied. Maggie, too, found herself staring out the window, the scenery blurring past as her mind raced. Eventually, they pulled up in front of a modest brick house with a well-kept lawn. Dr. Martin cut the engine and turned to Maggie. "Roger's a good guy. He's retired, but he still keeps up with the field. Just be prepared. He might have a lot of questions." Maggie nodded, gripping the bag a little tighter as they walked up to the front door. Dr. Martin knocked, and after a moment, the door swung open to reveal a man in his 60s with silver hair and sharp blue eyes. "Mike, good to see you," Roger said, shaking his hand. His gaze then shifted to Maggie. "And you must be the one who found it." "Well, technically my dog did," Maggie said, managing a small smile. "But yeah." Roger chuckled and stepped aside. "Come on in, let's take a look." The inside of Roger's house was lined with bookshelves, each one overflowing with thick volumes and stacks of papers. A large wooden desk sat by the window, covered in notebooks and maps. The air smelled of old books and freshly brewed coffee. Maggie and Dr. Martin followed him into a small study, where Roger cleared a space on the desk. "All right," he said, rubbing his hands together. "Let's see what we've got." Maggie carefully unwrapped the object and placed it in front of him. Roger leaned in, his expression shifting from curiosity to something much more serious. He traced the engravings with his fingers, his eyes narrowing as he studied the surface. Minutes passed in silence. Finally, Roger let out a breath and looked up. "Where exactly did you say this was found?" Maggie swallowed. "In the woods behind my house. My dog dug it up." Roger nodded slowly. "And it was just lying there?" "Buried," Maggie corrected, "but not too deep. Hank was able to dig it up pretty easily." Roger sat back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the desk. "This isn't something you'd expect to find in Indiana, or anywhere in the U.S. for that matter." Dr. Martin and Maggie exchanged a glance. "What do you mean?" Dr. Martin asked. Roger sighed. "It looks like it might be an artifact. And not just any artifact, potentially something old, very old." Maggie's pulse quickened. "How old are we talking?" Roger hesitated. "I can't say for sure without more testing, but if my hunch is right, this could be ancient, and not from around here." A silence settled over the room. Maggie felt the weight of his words pressing down on her. Ancient. Not from around here. The implications were overwhelming. Dr. Martin cleared his throat. "So what's the next step?" Roger ran a hand through his hair. "We need to get this analyzed properly. I have a contact at the university who might be able to help. But Maggie, you may have just stumbled onto something really significant." Maggie exhaled, her mind spinning. Yesterday, this had just been an odd little discovery. Now, it was starting to feel much, much bigger. Roger picked up the object again, turning it over in his hands. I'll make some calls, but in the meantime, I'd keep this quiet. You never know who might be interested in something like this. Maggie nodded, her grip tightening on the edge of the desk. She had a feeling that whatever they were about to uncover was only just beginning. Maggie barely noticed the drive home. Her mind spun with Roger's words, his cautious tone still ringing in her ears. She had started the morning thinking she was dealing with some kind of old trinket, maybe a piece of farming equipment left behind generations ago. But this? An artifact? Something ancient and out of place? It made her stomach twist in knots. Dr. Martin was quiet beside her, his hands steady on the wheel, but his jaw was set. He had seemed just as shaken as she was by Roger's reaction. If even he was unnerved, that meant something. "You okay?" he asked, finally breaking the silence. "Not really," Maggie admitted. "This was just supposed to be a weird little mystery, you know? Something Hank dug up that we'd get a quick answer for and move on. But now it feels like I've stumbled into something I shouldn't have." Dr. Martin sighed. "I get it. Roger's a careful guy, though. If he says he's going to look into it, he will. We just have to be patient." Maggie nodded but said nothing. When they pulled into her driveway, Hank was waiting at the window, his ears perking up the moment he spotted her. The second she opened the door, he bounded toward her, tail wagging like nothing in the world had changed. Maggie knelt down and ruffled his fur. "You really started something, buddy." Hank just licked her face, completely unaware of the weight pressing down on her shoulders. Dr. Martin stepped inside behind her. "Want me to stay for a bit?" "I think I just need some time to process," she said, forcing a small smile. "But thanks for today. I appreciate you coming with me." He nodded, glancing toward the window before looking back at her. "Just keep your phone close. And if anything else seems off, if anyone starts asking questions, call me." That warning sent a fresh shiver down her spine, but she nodded, watching as he made his way back to his truck. Once he was gone, Maggie locked the door and leaned against it, exhaling slowly. Hank trotted over, his head tilting as he studied her expression. I know, I'm acting weird," she muttered. "Let's go for a walk." She grabbed his leash and headed back out, choosing a different path this time, one that led deeper into the woods. She needed space, fresh air, something to help her clear her head. The trees swayed gently in the afternoon breeze, the sunlight filtering through the branches in golden streaks. The world felt normal again, at least for a little while. Hank sniffed eagerly at the ground, his nose twitching as he followed some invisible trail. Maggie let him lead, lost in thought as she replayed everything Roger had said. Something old, something that didn't belong here. Keep quiet. What had she gotten herself into? Hank suddenly let out a small whimper, breaking her out of her thoughts. He had stopped a few feet ahead, staring at something near the base of a tree. Maggie's breath caught as she stepped forward. At first, she didn't see anything unusual, just fallen leaves, patches of grass, the occasional broken twig. But then she noticed it, something half buried beneath the dirt. Another object. Her pulse quickened as she crouched down, brushing the soil away. It wasn't identical to the first one, but it had the same smooth surface, the same strange engravings along its sides. Hank let out a soft whine, shifting on his paws. Maggie swallowed hard. Finding one strange object had been odd enough. But two? This wasn't just some lost piece of junk. Something was here. Something had been buried. And now she was starting to think she wasn't supposed to find it. She carefully wrapped the new object in the edge of her jacket, her heart pounding as she stood. She needed to tell Dr. Martin, maybe even Roger, but a sharp rustling in the trees made her freeze. She turned, scanning the woods. Nothing, just shifting leaves in the wind. But suddenly, the air felt different, heavy, as if someone or something was watching. "Come on, Hank," she whispered, tightening her grip on the leash. "Let's go." Hank hesitated before obeying, his tail tucked slightly between his legs. He felt it too. Maggie quickened her pace, keeping her eyes on the trail ahead. By the time she reached her house, she barely remembered the walk back. Her mind was too focused on what she had just found and the feeling that someone had been out there, watching. She locked the door the second she stepped inside. Then, pulling out her phone, she dialed Dr. Martin's number with shaky fingers. "Maggie?" He answered almost immediately. "I found another one," she said breathlessly. "Another object. It was buried, too." Silence. Then, "Are you home?" "Yeah." "Stay there. I'm on my way." She hung up and set the second object next to the first on her kitchen table. Two. Almost identical. She swallowed hard. Hank sat beside her, his warm presence a small comfort in the growing uncertainty. Dr. Martin arrived within 15 minutes, stepping inside without hesitation. "Show me." Maggie led him to the kitchen, and his expression darkened the second he saw the second object. "This just got a whole lot bigger." Maggie rubbed her arms. "What do we do?" He exhaled. "We call Roger, right now." She nodded and handed him her phone. As he dialed, Maggie paced, her nerves rattling. She caught snippets of the conversation. Roger's shocked voice, his insistence that they bring both objects to him immediately. By the time Dr. Martin hung up, his expression was serious. "We leave first thing in the morning. Roger's bringing in an expert." Maggie swallowed, nodding. "Okay." She barely slept that night. Hank stayed close to her, his body pressed against the side of the bed as if sensing she needed the comfort. Every small sound outside made her heart jump. By the time morning arrived, she was already dressed, the objects carefully packed away. Dr. Martin arrived just after sunrise, and they wasted no time getting on the road. The drive to Roger's felt different this time. He had sounded urgent on the phone, and Maggie's nerves were stretched tight. When they arrived, Roger was waiting at the door, another man beside him, taller, with sharp features and dark hair streaked with gray. "This is Dr. David Langley," Roger introduced. "He's an expert in ancient artifacts." Dr. Langley wasted no time. "Let's see what you found." Maggie and Dr. Martin followed them inside. Roger led them to his study, clearing space on the table. Maggie carefully unwrapped the objects and set them down. Dr. Langley leaned in immediately, adjusting his glasses as he examined them. Minutes passed in silence. Then, very slowly, he turned to Roger. "These aren't from here." Maggie's stomach flipped. "What do you mean?" Dr. Langley straightened. "These engravings. This material. It doesn't match anything found in this region. It barely matches anything found in this country. These look like they belong to a civilization that predates recorded history in North America. And if that's true, it would rewrite what we know about early human presence here." Maggie's throat felt dry. "So what do we do?" Dr. Langley hesitated. "We need to be careful. If word of this gets out, there will be people who want to take it. Governments, collectors, even looters. You need to keep this quiet. For now." Maggie swallowed hard. This wasn't just a strange find anymore. This was something bigger than she ever could have imagined, and somehow it had all started with Hank digging in the dirt. Maggie could feel her heart pounding as Dr. Langley's words settled over the room. This wasn't just a strange object. This wasn't just an odd coincidence. This was history, real, tangible history, sitting on the table in front of them, and it shouldn't have been there. The weight of that realization made her hands clammy. Roger folded his arms, his face unreadable. "You're sure about this?" Dr. Langley nodded, "As sure as I can be without running further tests. But I've seen enough to say these don't belong in Indiana. They don't belong anywhere near here. If these artifacts are as old as I think they are, they predate any known settlements in this region by thousands of years, and yet, here they are." Maggie swallowed hard. "What do we do now?" Dr. Langley hesitated, glancing at Roger before answering. "First, we keep this quiet. If the wrong people hear about this, it could be a disaster. There are collectors who would pay a fortune for something like this. And once it's out there, it's nearly impossible to get it back. But more than that, this could change everything we know about the past. We need to handle this carefully." Maggie rubbed her temples. She had gone from worrying about a simple dog discovery to suddenly being responsible for something far bigger than herself. "So you're saying we sit on this? Just pretend like we never found it?" "Not exactly, Roger said, "but we need to be smart. The university will have the resources to examine these properly. But if we go through official channels too soon, it could attract attention. We need to figure out the safest way to proceed." Maggie didn't like it. Every instinct told her that sitting on something this important was a mistake. But at the same time, she wasn't an archaeologist. She wasn't a historian. She had no idea what she was dealing with. She exhaled, glancing at Dr. Martin, who had been quiet throughout the conversation. "What do you think?" Dr. Martin hesitated before answering. "I think they're right. You've already found 2, Maggie. Who's to say there aren't more? And if someone else finds out about this before we understand what we're dealing with, it could cause a lot of problems." The thought made her stomach twist. If these objects had been buried out there for centuries, why was she suddenly finding them now? And more importantly, were they the only ones looking? Dr. Langley pushed his chair back and stood. "I'm going to take some photos, but I won't document them officially yet. For now, I'll run some basic tests, see what I can find out without raising any red flags. But you," he turned to Maggie, "need to be careful. If there's more out there, someone might already be looking for them." The words sent a chill down her spine. She had already felt that eerie sensation in the woods, the feeling that she wasn't alone. Now she couldn't shake the idea that she really wasn't. Roger clapped his hands together, breaking the heavy silence. "All right, let's be smart about this. Maggie, I think it'd be best if you didn't go looking for more. At least not until we know what we're dealing with." Maggie nodded automatically, but deep down, she wasn't so sure she could follow that advice. Something was nagging at her, telling her that this wasn't over, not even close. By the time she and Dr. Martin left Roger's house, the sun had begun its slow descent, casting a golden hue over the horizon. The drive home felt longer than before, every minute filled with quiet contemplation. Dr. Martin finally broke the silence. "Are you okay?" Maggie let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "I don't know. This whole thing feels, bigger than me. And I don't like the idea of sitting around, waiting." Dr. Martin frowned, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel. "I get it, but until we have more information, we can't risk drawing attention to this. The last thing we need is someone showing up at your house asking questions." The thought made her uneasy. She had always felt safe in her little town, tucked away in the quiet countryside. But now, for the first time, she felt exposed. When they finally pulled into her driveway, the porch light flickered on automatically. Hank was waiting at the window again, his tail thumping against the glass the moment he spotted her. Maggie smiled despite everything, reaching over to squeeze Dr. Martin's arm. "Thanks for today. I know this is a lot." He nodded. "Get some rest. And Maggie, don't go looking for more. Not yet." She gave a non-committal nod before stepping out of the car. As she walked toward the house, the weight of the day settled onto her shoulders. Hank greeted her at the door, wiggling excitedly before trotting in circles around her. She let out a tired chuckle, rubbing his head. "You really started something, didn't you?" He barked happily, oblivious to her worries. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every sound outside made her flinch. Her mind spun with questions. Why now? Why her? Were these artifacts the only ones buried out there, or were they part of something bigger? She tossed and turned, her thoughts a tangled mess. Finally, just as she was beginning to drift off, Hank lifted his head suddenly, ears pricked forward, Maggie's stomach clenched. "What is it, boy?" Hank let out a low, uneasy growl, his gaze locked on the window. Maggie sat up slowly, her heart pounding. She glanced toward the curtains, half expecting to see a shadow moving outside. But there was nothing, just the wind rustling the trees. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling creeping over her skin. Someone was watching. Maggie barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw shapes moving in the shadows of the trees, heard whispers that didn't belong. Every creak of the house made her sit up, heart pounding, ears straining for something, anything out of the ordinary. But nothing happened. Not really. Hank eventually settled down, but Maggie didn't. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for a feeling she couldn't explain to pass. By the time morning came, she felt like she hadn't slept at all. The world outside looked the same as always, the sun rising over the trees, casting long shadows over the grass, birds chirping like they did every morning. But something was different. It wasn't just in her head. She could feel it, like the air itself had shifted, like something unseen was pressing down on her house. Hank was unusually quiet as she fed him, his tail not wagging as eagerly as usual. He stuck close to her side, watching the door, sniffing the air every few minutes as if waiting for something. That only made her more uneasy. Maggie pulled out her phone and hesitated before dialing Dr. Martin's number. What would she even say? That her dog had a bad feeling? That she couldn't shake the sense of being watched? It all sounded ridiculous. After a long moment, she sighed and put the phone down. Maybe she was just letting her imagination get the best of her. She had work to do, chores to finish, a normal life to get back to. And yet, even as she tried to go through the motions, her mind kept drifting back to the woods. Back to the spot where Hank had found the second artifact, back to the way the trees had rustled when there was no wind, back to the feeling that something, or someone, had been there. By midday, she couldn't take it anymore. She had promised Roger and Dr. Martin she wouldn't go looking for more, but she hadn't promised to sit in her house and do nothing either. "Come on, Hank," she said, grabbing his leash. "We're going back." Hank hesitated, something he never did. Usually the word walk was enough to have him sprinting to the door, but this time he let out a small whimper and lowered his head. Maggie frowned. "What's wrong, boy?" Hank glanced toward the back door, and toward the woods, then back at her. He didn't want to go. A small shiver ran down her spine. "Just for a little bit, okay? Just to see if there's anything else out there. Then we'll come right back." Hank let out a quiet sigh before following her to the door. She clipped his leash on, though she had a feeling she wouldn't need it. He was sticking close today, and that only made her feel more on edge. The woods were different in the daylight, less eerie, but not entirely comforting either. Maggie moved carefully, her boots crunching against the fallen leaves as she traced the path back to where Hank had found the second artifact. She kept glancing over her shoulder, expecting to see someone or something lurking behind her. But the woods were empty, or at least they seemed that way. Hank stayed close, his ears twitching at every sound. Maggie knelt beside the spot where she had dug up the second artifact. The dirt was still loose, disturbed, as if something had been moved. But there was nothing else there. No sign of anyone having been here overnight. No footprints, no broken branches. She exhaled slowly. Maybe she really was overthinking this. Maybe her nerves were just getting the best of her. And then Hank growled. It was low, deep, the kind of growl she had never heard from him before. The fur along his back bristled as he turned his head towards something in the distance. Maggie's pulse spiked. "What is it?" Hank didn't move. His body was tense, his gaze locked on something deeper in the woods. Maggie followed his eyes, but she didn't see anything. Just trees and more trees, stretching endlessly into the distance. But Hank saw something. He smelled something. Maggie tightened her grip on his leash. "All right, let's go." Hank didn't argue. He backed away with her, his ears still perked, his attention never leaving that one spot in the woods. She walked faster than she normally would, resisting the urge to break into a run. Running would only make her panic more. But she didn't slow down until she was back inside her house, the door locked behind her. Only then did she let herself breathe. Hank sat by the door, staring at it, still uneasy. Maggie rubbed her arms. She had no proof that anything was wrong, but her gut told her otherwise. She grabbed her phone and dialed Dr. Martin. He picked up on the second ring. "Maggie, something's wrong." A pause. "What happened?" She swallowed. Hank didn't want to go into the woods today. And when we got there, he growled at something I couldn't see. I don't think we were alone out there. Dr. Martin was quiet for a moment before saying, "Stay put. I'm coming over." Maggie nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "Okay." She hung up and sat down beside Hank, resting a hand on his back. "What did you see out there, buddy?" Hank let out a low whine and rested his head on her lap. They waited. When Dr. Martin arrived, Maggie felt a wave of relief. He stepped inside quickly, closing the door behind him. "Tell me everything." She did. Every detail. The uneasy feeling. The way Hank had reacted. The way she had felt like she was being watched, even though there was no one there. Dr. Martin listened intently, his expression growing more serious by the second. "I don't like this," he muttered. "Not one bit." Maggie leaned forward. "What do we do?" He ran a hand through his hair. "First, we tell Roger. He needs to know that someone, or something, might be out there. And second, you need to be careful, Maggie. If there's someone looking for those artifacts, they might already know about you." The word sent a chill down her spine. "You think someone's watching me?" Dr. Martin didn't answer right away. "I think we need to be cautious. Keep your doors locked. Keep your phone close. And if you see anything, you call me." Maggie nodded. "Okay." He exhaled. "I'll call Roger. We'll figure this out." As he stepped outside to make the call, Maggie looked down at Hank, who was still watching the door, ears perked, eyes alert. She had a sinking feeling that whatever was happening, it wasn't over yet, not even close. Maggie barely moved from her spot on the couch after Dr. Martin left. Hank stayed close, his head resting on her knee as she absent-mindedly ran her fingers through his fur. Her mind was still caught in the moment in the woods, the way Hank had growled at something unseen, something she had felt but couldn't explain. She reached for her phone, checking the time. Roger should have heard from Dr. Martin by now. Part of her wanted to call, to demand answers, but she forced herself to wait. She wasn't sure what answers she even expected. There was nothing concrete, nothing to prove that someone had been out there with her and Hank. But she knew. Deep down, she knew. When her phone finally rang, she answered it immediately. "Roger? It's me, Dr. Martin said. Roger's taking this seriously. He wants us to be careful. He also mentioned something else. Something strange." Maggie's fingers tightened around the phone. "What?" Dr. Martin hesitated. "A few years ago, a group of amateur archaeologists tried digging around those woods. They were looking for old settlements, maybe even artifacts. But they stopped. Fast. No real explanation. They just packed up and left. Roger thought it was odd at the time, but didn't think much of it. Now he's wondering if they found something, and if so, whether someone told them to stop." Maggie swallowed hard. "You think someone scared them off?" "Maybe. Or maybe they knew they were on to something they weren't supposed to find. Either way, Roger's reaching out to one of the men who is on that dig. He's going to try to find out why they abandoned it." A cold knot tightened in Maggie's stomach. If they were looking near my property, they might have been close to whatever Hank found. "Exactly," Dr. Martin said. "And if they were scared away, that means someone else might already know those artifacts are there, and they might be watching to make sure no one else finds them." Maggie's breath hitched. "So you do think I'm being watched?" Dr. Martin didn't answer right away. "I think we need to assume the possibility. Keep your doors locked, stay alert, and for now, don't go back out there alone." Maggie rubbed her eyes. "What if it's already too late? What if they already know I have the artifacts?" Dr. Martin's voice softened. "Then we're going to make sure you stay safe. You're not in this alone, Maggie." She nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "Okay." After they hung up, she sat there in silence. The house felt different now. The walls too thin, the windows too exposed. She stood abruptly and checked the locks, even pulling the curtains closed. It didn't make her feel much better, but at least it was something. Hank followed her every step, his eyes filled with quiet understanding. "We'll be okay, buddy," she murmured, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Maggie forced herself to do normal things, laundry, cooking, anything to keep herself busy. But her mind kept wandering back to the woods, to the artifacts, to the lingering feeling that someone had been there with her. By nightfall, she was exhausted, but she doubted she'd be able to sleep. She double-checked the doors again, turned on the porch light, and finally sat down on the couch with Hank curled beside her. She reached for the remote, flipping through channels aimlessly before settling on something she wasn't really watching. Then Hank lifted his head. Maggie froze. His ears twitched. His body went still. Then came the low growl, deep in his throat, quiet but firm. Her heart pounded as she muted the TV, straining to hear whatever had caught Hank's attention. The house was silent. The world outside was still, but Hank was looking toward the back door. Maggie's breath came shallow as she reached for her phone, fingers hovering over Dr. Martin's number. Then she heard it. A rustling. Soft. Barely there. But something was moving outside. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. She glanced at the window, but the curtains were drawn. She couldn't see out, and if she looked, whoever was out there would see her too. Hank's growl deepened. Maggie took a slow breath and stood, phone still in her hand. She moved toward the light switch, keeping her steps silent. If someone was out there, she didn't want them knowing she had heard. She flipped off the porch light. Darkness swallowed the backyard. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She waited, listening. The rustling stopped. The air was thick with tension. And then, a shadow shifted just outside the window. Maggie sucked in a sharp breath, her fingers tightening around her phone. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to hide. They wanted her to know they were there. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to call someone, to do something. But before she could react, the shadow disappeared. The rustling returned, moving away this time. Whoever had been outside was leaving. She waited, counting the seconds, barely daring to breathe. Then, when she was sure they were gone, she exhaled shakily and quickly called Dr. Martin. He answered immediately. "Maggie?" "Someone was outside," she whispered, still staring at the window. "I couldn't see who, but they were there. They wanted me to know." Dr. Martin cursed under his breath. "I'm coming over. Don't open the door until you know it's me." She nodded, even though he couldn't see. "Hurry." She hung up and sat on the floor beside Hank, her hands shaking as she stroked his fur. He was still tense, his eyes locked on the door. He hadn't stopped growling. 15 minutes later, headlights swept through the window. Maggie scrambled to her feet, double-checking before unlocking the door for Dr. Martin. He stepped inside quickly, his jaw tight. "Where?" She motioned toward the back window. "They were standing right there. I didn't see a face, just the shadow, but they didn't run. They wanted me to see them." Dr. Martin moved to the window, scanning the darkness outside. Nothing now, but they could come back. Maggie folded her arms, trying to steady herself. "I don't understand. Why not just break in? Why not take what they want? Why just stand there?" Dr. Martin exhaled. "Maybe it was a warning. Maybe they wanted to scare you. Maybe they're waiting to see what you do next." Maggie shivered. "Well, it worked. I'm scared." Dr. Martin turned to her, his eyes serious. "We need to figure out our next move, because whoever was out there, they're not done." Maggie sat stiffly on the couch, arms wrapped around herself as Dr. Martin checked the locks for the third time. Hank hadn't moved from his spot near the door, ears twitching at every sound. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on her, making it hard to think straight. Someone had been outside, watching, waiting. And now they were gone, but for how long? The thought made her skin crawl. Dr. Martin finally turned back to her, his face serious. "You need to stay somewhere else for a few days. This place is too isolated. If they come back..." Maggie shook her head before he could finish. "No, this is my home. I'm not going to let some creep scare me away." Dr. Martin sighed. "I get it, but we don't know who we're dealing with. And if they wanted you to know they were here, that means they're confident. That's not good." Maggie ran a hand through her hair, frustration bubbling up. "I just don't understand. Why not just take the artifacts? Why not break in? Why stand outside and make sure I see them?" Dr. Martin hesitated. "Maybe they're testing you, seeing if you'll hand them over on your own. Or maybe they're trying to intimidate you into doing something." Maggie's stomach twisted. "Like what?" "Like going back into the woods." The thought made her breath hitch. She had already been drawn back once, even when she promised herself she wouldn't. And now, if this person wanted her to return, it meant there was something else waiting for her out there. Dr. Martin must have seen the look on her face because he took a step closer. "Maggie, listen to me. I know you want answers, but if they're trying to bait you, it means they're watching. And if they're watching, that means you're in more danger than you realize." Maggie swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing. "So what do I do? Just sit here and wait?" "No," Dr. Martin said. "You do nothing. You let me and Roger figure this out. We'll get to the bottom of it, but you need to stay safe." Maggie wanted to argue, but the exhaustion was catching up to her. "Fine, but I'm not leaving my house." Dr. Martin didn't look happy, but he nodded. "All right, then I'm staying too." Maggie blinked. "What?" "I'm not leaving you here alone," he said simply. "At least not tonight." She opened her mouth to protest, but stopped. Truth be told, she didn't want to be alone. Not after what just happened. Not with the feeling still lingering in her chest that someone was out there, waiting for her to make a move. So she nodded. "Okay." Dr. Martin settled in on the recliner while Maggie took the couch. Hank sprawled between them, his body tense even as his eyes drooped with exhaustion. The night stretched on, long and restless. Every sound outside made Maggie flinch. The wind against the window, the distant hoot of an owl. Even the hum of the refrigerator sounded too loud in the silence. But nothing happened. No more shadows. No more rustling outside. Just the heavy weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. By the time morning came, she was still awake, staring at the ceiling as soft light filtered through the curtains. Dr. Martin stirred in his chair, rubbing his face before looking over at her. "Get any sleep?" "No," Maggie muttered. He sighed. "I'll make coffee." While he busied himself in the kitchen, Maggie sat up, stretching out the stiffness in her muscles. Hank followed her to the window, tail flicking nervously as she peeked out. The backyard looked the same, normal, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there. When Dr. Martin returned with 2 mugs, he handed her one and sat down beside her. "Roger called me this morning. He's meeting with one of the guys from that old dig today." Maggie's heart skipped. And we wait," Dr. Martin said. "Once Roger gets some answers, we'll know how to move forward." Maggie exhaled, gripping the warm mug between her hands. She hated waiting. Every second that passed made her feel more restless, more trapped, but she knew there was nothing else she could do. For now. The day passed slowly. Dr. Martin stayed with her, keeping things light, making small talk, keeping Hank entertained. But beneath it all, Maggie could feel the tension simmering. Neither of them were really relaxed. They were both waiting. When Roger finally called that evening, Maggie answered before the first ring finished. "What did you find out?" Roger's voice was grave. "You were right to be worried. The guy I talked to, his name's Jeff, he was part of that dig 5 years ago, and he told me that they didn't leave because they lost interest. They left because someone told them to." Maggie gripped the phone tighter. "Who?" "He doesn't know," Roger said. "But one night after a long day of digging, they went back to their tents to find everything torn apart. Their notes were missing, their equipment was smashed. There was no sign of an animal, no footprints, nothing. Just destruction. It was enough to scare them. They packed up the next day and never went back." Maggie's breath came shallow. "And they never told anyone?" "They tried," Roger said. "Jeff said they reported it to the university, but nothing ever came of it. No investigation, no follow-up. It was like it never happened." Dr. Martin, who had been listening, muttered, "Someone covered it up." Maggie's pulse raced. So whoever scared them off might still be out there, watching, waiting. Roger was quiet for a moment before saying, "Maggie, I think you need to consider that this is bigger than we thought. This isn't just about artifacts anymore. This is about someone making sure those artifacts stay buried." Maggie's fingers tightened around the phone. "So what do we do?" "We keep digging," Roger said, carefully, quietly, "and you stay safe. Don't go back out there, Maggie, not yet." Maggie exhaled slowly. "Okay." They hung up, leaving the room thick with silence. Dr. Martin finally spoke. "This is bad." Maggie looked at him. "I know." He ran a hand through his hair. "But it also means we're on the right track." Maggie swallowed. "Yeah, but if we keep going, what happens when we get too close?" Dr. Martin didn't have an answer for that, and neither did she. The next morning, Maggie woke up with an uneasy feeling settled deep in her chest. Dr. Martin was already awake, drinking coffee at the kitchen table, while Hank lay curled up at his feet. The tension from the previous night hadn't faded, and the weight of Roger's warning still hung in the air. "Any word from Roger?" Maggie asked, rubbing the sleep from her eyes as she poured herself a cup of coffee. Dr. Martin shook his head. Not yet, but I called him earlier, and he said he was going to follow up with Jeff, see if there's anything else he remembers. Maggie nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Whoever had been watching her wasn't going to wait forever. The longer they stayed quiet, the more she felt like something was creeping closer, waiting for her to slip up. Dr. Martin must have noticed the way she was gripping her coffee mug, because he sighed and leaned forward. Maggie, I know this is hard, but we have to be smart about this. We can't just rush in without knowing what we're dealing with. I know, she muttered, staring down at the dark liquid in her mug. I just hate feeling like I'm waiting for something to happen. Dr. Martin nodded, but before he could respond, Hank's head snapped up. His ears pricked, and his body went tense. A low growl rumbled in his throat. Maggie's stomach flipped. What is it, boy? Hank got to his feet, staring at the front door. Maggie and Dr. Martin exchanged a look before Maggie slowly set her coffee down and walked toward the window. Carefully, she pulled back the curtain just enough to see outside. Nothing. The road was empty. The trees were still. There was no movement, no sign that anyone had been there. But Hank didn't relax. His tail was stiff, his body alert, his gaze locked on something unseen. Maggie swallowed hard. I don't see anything. Dr. Martin stood and walked toward the door, peering through the peephole. He was silent for a long moment before he turned back to her, his face grim. Someone left something on your porch? Maggie's blood ran cold. What? Dr. Martin reached for the door, unlocking it carefully before pulling it open just enough to step out. Hank barked sharply, but Dr. Martin didn't hesitate. He bent down and picked something up, then stepped back inside and shut the door. Maggie's breath caught when she saw what he was holding, a small, dirt-covered cloth bundle. The fabric was old, frayed at the edges, tied tightly with a thin rope. Whatever was inside was solid, heavy. Dr. Martin set it down on the table, and Maggie stared at it, her heart pounding. Should we open it? She whispered. Dr. Martin nodded. We need to know what we're dealing with. Maggie swallowed hard and reached forward, fingers trembling as she untied the knot. The rope fell away, and she carefully unwrapped the cloth. Inside was another artifact. This one was different from the others. It was smaller, smoother, with carvings that looked even more intricate. But what made Maggie's skin prickle with unease was the fact that someone had left it there. Someone wanted her to have it. Dr. Martin exhaled sharply. This is a message. Maggie nodded, her throat tight. But from who? Dr. Martin stared at the artifact for a long moment. I don't know, but I think it's time we find out. Maggie's fingers tightened around the cloth. What do we do now? Dr. Martin glanced at the window, his jaw clenched. We call Roger, and then we figure out who just put this on your doorstep. Maggie stared at the artifact, her pulse hammering. They know exactly where I live. Dr. Martin nodded grimly. Yeah, and that means they're not just watching from a distance. They're close. Close enough to walk up to your door without you noticing. A shiver ran down Maggie's spine. She had checked the locks, made sure everything was secure, but somehow, this still ended up on her doorstep. That meant someone had come in the dead of night, silent and deliberate, to leave her this package. She picked up her phone, her hands slightly shaking as she dialed Roger's number. He answered on the second ring. Maggie? Someone left another artifact on my porch, she said, her voice tight. We just found it. It was wrapped up like it had been buried, but it wasn't buried. It was right outside my front door. There was a long pause before Roger spoke again, his voice more serious than she'd ever heard it. You need to get out of there. Maggie's heart pounded. What? This isn't just about artifacts anymore, Roger said. Someone is sending you a message, and until we know who or why, you shouldn't be staying there alone. Dr. Martin gestured for her to put the phone on speaker. She did, setting it on the table between them. "Roger, what do you think this means?" Dr. Martin asked. Roger let out a breath. "It means we're not just dealing with an unknown discovery. We're dealing with someone who wants to control it, and Maggie is now a part of whatever game they're playing." Maggie's stomach twisted. "So, what do we do?" "Bring the artifact to me," Roger said. "I want to compare it with the others. If this was left as a message, maybe it has something unique about it, something they want us to notice." Dr. Martin nodded. "We'll leave soon." "And Maggie," Roger added, his voice firm, "be careful. Whoever did this isn't done yet." Maggie swallowed hard. "I know." As they hung up, silence settled over the room. The morning sun cast long shadows across the floor, but it did nothing to ease the heavy feeling in Maggie's chest. Dr. Martin stood, grabbing his coat. "Get whatever you need. We're not waiting around for them to make the next move." Maggie nodded, reaching for the artifact and wrapping it back up in the cloth. Whatever was happening, it was escalating, and she wasn't about to sit around and wait for whoever was watching to decide what happened next. Maggie packed quickly, shoving a few essentials into a backpack along with the artifact, keeping it wrapped tightly in the cloth. Dr. Martin stood near the window, watching the yard with a tense expression. Hank paced beside the door, his tail stiff, ears twitching with every sound. "We'll take my truck," Dr. Martin said, "less noticeable than your car." Maggie nodded, zipping up her bag and slinging it over her shoulder. Her pulse raced as she reached for Hank's leash, clipping it onto his collar. "Let's just get out of here." Dr. Martin led the way, stepping outside first to scan the yard. The morning air was crisp, the silence heavier than it should have been. Maggie followed, keeping Hank close as she locked the door behind her. Every step to the truck felt like walking through quicksand, her senses hyper-aware of the fact that someone could be watching. They climbed inside, and Dr. Martin wasted no time starting the engine. As they pulled out of the driveway, Maggie glanced at the trees lining her property, half expecting to see a shadow move between them. But there was nothing, just the empty road stretching ahead. The drive to Roger's house was quiet at first, tension thick between them. Maggie gripped the straps of her backpack, staring out the window as the trees blurred past. "Do you think whoever left the artifact is following us?" she finally asked. Dr. Martin kept his eyes on the road. "I don't know, but we're going to assume they are." Maggie exhaled slowly. "Great. That's comforting." "Look, we don't know what they want yet," he said, "but they left that artifact for a reason. Maybe it's a warning. Maybe it's something else. We just have to figure out what." Maggie pressed a hand to her temple, trying to push back the pounding headache forming. "I don't like being part of someone else's game." Dr. Martin gave her a sidelong glance. "Neither do I, but right now, we need answers, and Roger's the best chance we've got." They arrived at Roger's an hour later, pulling into his gravel driveway. His house was tucked away behind a dense line of trees, giving it a secluded feel that made Maggie uneasy. She was beginning to hate the isolation of all these places. It made it too easy for someone to hide. Roger was already waiting on the porch when they stepped out of the truck. He had a grim expression, his arms crossed as he watched them approach. "Come inside," he said without preamble. "We don't want to do this out here." Maggie and Dr. Martin exchanged a glance before following him in. The inside of Roger's house was cluttered but familiar. Books stacked in uneven piles, old maps pinned to the walls, a desk overflowing with papers. It smelled of coffee and dust, a strange mix of comfort and tension. Roger motioned for them to sit at the large wooden table in the center of the room. "Let's see it." Maggie carefully unwrapped the artifact, placing it on the table. Roger leaned in immediately, his fingers tracing the carvings with the careful precision of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. His brow furrowed. This is different. The patterns, look at these symbols. They don't match the others. Maggie leaned forward. What does that mean? Roger didn't answer immediately. He pulled a notebook from a nearby shelf, flipping through pages filled with sketches and notes. Finally, he stopped on a page covered in similar symbols. This is from a site I studied years ago. The symbols aren't identical, but they're close. Too close to be coincidence. Dr. Martin frowned. And where was this site? Roger hesitated before answering. South America. Maggie's stomach dropped. You're saying these artifacts, they're not even from here? Roger exhaled. That's what it's starting to look like. If these symbols are related, then whoever left this on your doorstep wanted you to see this connection. They wanted you to start asking questions. Maggie rubbed her arms, suddenly cold. But why? If they want me to back off, why give me more clues? Roger drummed his fingers against the table. Because maybe they don't want you to back off. Maybe they want you to keep digging. Dr. Martin shook his head. That doesn't make sense. If they were trying to scare her, they wouldn't be handing her more pieces of the puzzle. Roger nodded slowly. Unless they're not the ones who scared off that dig team 5 years ago. Maggie's breath hitched. You think there's more than one group involved? Roger met her gaze. I think it's very possible. The room fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down on them. Maggie ran a hand through her hair, frustration mounting. So now what? We just sit here and wait for the next move? Roger shook his head. No. We figure out where these artifacts are leading us. Maggie hesitated before asking the question that had been nagging at her since this all started. And what happens when we get there? Roger's expression darkened. I guess we're going to find out. The weight of Roger's words settled over the room. Maggie sat back, arms crossed tightly, trying to process everything. Her mind raced with questions she wasn't sure she wanted answers to. The idea that there was more than one group involved, that someone might actually want her to keep digging, felt like too much. She'd thought this was just some strange coincidence, a bizarre discovery in the woods. Now it felt like something much bigger. Dr. Martin broke the silence. If there are multiple groups involved, we need to figure out who's who. Roger, do you have any idea who might be pushing her to keep going? Roger leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. It's hard to say, but if these symbols are connected to the site I studied in South America, then it's possible we're dealing with people who have a vested interest in uncovering or protecting certain historical artifacts. Maggie frowned. Protecting them from what? Roger hesitated. From being found. Dr. Martin looked skeptical. But why would they leave something on her porch if they didn't want her to find it? Maybe they don't all agree on what to do, Roger suggested. One group could be trying to keep the artifacts hidden, while another wants them discovered. If that's the case, Maggie's caught in the middle of a larger conflict. Maggie's stomach twisted. I didn't sign up for this. I just found something my dog dug up. I didn't ask for any of this. Roger gave her a sympathetic look. I know, but sometimes we don't get to choose. And the fact is, you're part of it now. The only way forward is to figure out what these artifacts mean and who's behind all of this. Maggie stood, pacing the room. Her nerves felt frayed, every muscle in her body wound tight. She hated the feeling of being out of control, of not knowing who to trust or what to expect. Hank watched her from his spot near the door, his ears twitching with every sharp movement she made. Dr. Martin turned to Roger. You said these symbols look familiar. Can you find any records of the ones you studied before? Maybe something that can help us understand what we're dealing with. Roger nodded. I'll pull my notes. I might still have some old photographs from the site. If we can match these symbols to a known civilization or culture, we might get a better idea of what's at stake. Maggie stopped pacing. And then what? Even if we know where they come from, how does that help us figure out who's watching me? Roger ran a hand through his graying hair. It might not tell us exactly who's watching, but it could tell us why. If these artifacts are part of a larger collection, or if they have some kind of historical significance, then we'll know what's motivating these people. Once we know that, we can start to piece together who they are. Maggie exhaled slowly, her shoulders slumping. Fine, but I don't want to stay in the dark forever. I need answers. Dr. Martin nodded. We'll get them. Roger stood, moving toward a stack of boxes in the corner of the room. He rifled through them, pulling out folders and old binders. Maggie watched as he laid them out on the table, spreading photographs and sketches across the surface. These are from the site in Peru, Roger said, pointing to a series of photographs. Notice the patterns here, this curved line, the repeated geometric shapes. They're not identical to the ones on your artifacts, but they're close enough that it could indicate a shared cultural origin. Maggie leaned in, studying the photographs. She couldn't make sense of the symbols, but the resemblance was clear. So you think these artifacts could have come from the same people who made these carvings? It's possible, Roger said, but what's more interesting is the timeline. These carvings were dated to over 2,000 years ago. If your artifacts are from the same time period, it raises the question of how they ended up here, in Indiana. Dr. Martin folded his arms. And why someone would want them hidden. Roger nodded. Exactly. Maggie's head was spinning. It felt like every answer only led to more questions. So what now? Roger tapped the table. I'll cross-reference these symbols with some of my older records. There might be something I missed before, something that could tell us more. In the meantime, you both need to be careful. If we're right about multiple groups being involved, it means someone could show up at any time, either to warn you off or to push you further. Maggie swallowed hard. How do we know who to trust? Roger looked at her, his expression serious. We don't. Not yet. That's why we need to keep this quiet. No one else can know about these artifacts until we understand what we're dealing with. Maggie sat back down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She hated the idea of waiting, of not knowing. But she also knew Roger was right. If they acted too quickly, if they drew too much attention, they might lose what little control they had. Dr. Martin rested a hand on her shoulder. We'll get to the bottom of this, but we have to take it one step at a time. Maggie nodded, even though she still felt like she was walking blind. At least now she wasn't walking alone. The rest of the day passed in a tense blur. Roger combed through his notes, searching for any clue that might connect the symbols. Dr. Martin stayed close to Maggie, keeping an eye on the windows and checking in with her every so often. Hank never left her side, his quiet presence the only thing that felt normal anymore. By evening, Roger finally looked up from his work. I think I've found something. Maggie and Dr. Martin joined him at the table. Roger pointed to a photocopied page from an old journal. This is from a dig site in the Amazon. The carvings here include a symbol that matches one of the patterns on your artifact almost exactly. Maggie's eyes widened. What does it mean? I don't know yet, Roger admitted, but it's a start. If this symbol appears in multiple locations, it might have been a marker of some kind, a way to identify an important object or a sacred item. Dr. Martin leaned over the table, and if it was sacred, then it might explain why someone wants it hidden. Roger nodded. That's my guess. Maggie frowned. But sacred to who? If these symbols are from a culture that lived thousands of years ago, why would someone today care enough to keep them buried? Roger didn't have an answer for that. He sat back, his expression thoughtful. It's possible that whatever these artifacts represent, their significance has been passed down through generations. There could be a group or multiple groups who see them as more than just historical relics. Dr. Martin folded his arms. Religious significance? Maybe, Roger said, or something else entirely. Maggie's head spun. She had started the day hoping for answers, but all she had now were more questions. She glanced at the artifact sitting in the center of the table, its carvings catching the light. Whatever it was, whoever it belonged to, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Maggie sat quietly at the table, her hands resting on the cool surface, her mind swimming with possibilities. Roger continued flipping through his notes, while Dr. Martin leaned back in his chair, his face set in deep thought. The room had fallen into a heavy silence as they all tried to piece together what they had learned so far. The symbols, the artifacts, the people leaving warnings or invitations. It was all connected, but the threads were still tangled. Every answer they uncovered seemed to lead to more questions, and Maggie was beginning to wonder if they would ever get the full picture. "Have you ever seen these symbols anywhere else?" Maggie asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. Her voice was steadier than she felt, though her hands betrayed her, trembling slightly on the table. Roger looked up from his notes, his expression thoughtful. "Not exactly, no. I mean, I've seen similar patterns, but nothing that matches perfectly. It's possible these artifacts come from a smaller, lesser-known group, a culture that wasn't widely documented." "So you think someone preserved their secrets?" Dr. Martin asked, his voice low. Roger nodded slowly. "It's possible. If this was a group that valued secrecy, or if they were forced to go into hiding, they might have hidden their artifacts and kept their knowledge within a small circle. Over time, those secrets could have passed down through families or through certain members of the community. That could explain why we have people who seem so invested in keeping these artifacts from being discovered." Maggie frowned. "But why would they show themselves now? If they've managed to keep these hidden for so long, what changed?" Roger tapped the table thoughtfully. "That's the real question, isn't it? What happened to make them start leaving artifacts on your porch? What changed their strategy?" No one had an answer. The three of them sat in heavy silence, the weight of the unknown pressing down on them. Maggie could feel her heart beating faster. She hated not knowing. She hated feeling like a pawn in someone else's game. Dr. Martin finally stood, running a hand through his hair. "We need to decide on a next step. We can't just keep sitting here, waiting for them to make the next move. We need to take control of this." Roger nodded. "Agreed, but we need to be careful. If we make the wrong move, it could tip them off. We don't know who we're dealing with yet." Maggie took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. "Then let's figure out who they are." Dr. Martin looked at her, his expression serious. "How?" Maggie leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table. "We use the artifacts. If they're leaving these as messages, we need to understand what they're trying to tell us. Roger, can you figure out the patterns? Can you match them to something that will give us a clue?" Roger's eyes narrowed. "I can try. It'll take time, but I'll go through everything I have. If there's a connection, I'll find it." Dr. Martin crossed his arms. "And in the meantime, what about the people watching her? We can't just ignore them." Maggie straightened, meeting his gaze. "Then we keep them guessing. We don't let them know what we're doing. We make it clear we're not scared, that we're not backing down. If they think we're onto something, maybe they'll slip up. Maybe they'll reveal themselves." Dr. Martin hesitated, then nodded. "It's risky, but it might work. We just need to be ready for anything." Maggie felt a spark of determination. For the first time in days, she felt like they had a plan. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. She wasn't going to sit around and wait for answers anymore. She was going to find them. As they began laying out their next steps, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the room. The air felt heavy, the weight of what they were about to do settling in. But despite the uncertainty, Maggie felt a sliver of hope. They were moving forward. They were finally taking control. It was time to uncover the truth, and she wasn't going to stop until she did.